Sometimes being away from the familiar is a great reminder of how good and gracious and kind God is. So I stepped away for a couple weeks and spent time with my bride and with our daughters and with some of my extended family. I was reminded over and over again, because sometimes I forget, that God's gracious hand, this open and loving and blessing hand of this Lord who has claimed us as His own, is open at every place in our lives. In all the corners, in all the hallways, in all the dining rooms, in all the breakfast rooms, and in the backyard, this gracious and wondrous hand of a God who has loved us with His life is open in every place in our lives. So I go and see my extended family, and gosh, we're getting older, all of us, me too. And one of the reminders is, as we get older, we are struck by how much we are alike. Though there were years when we denied that was true. And so as we grow older, sometimes gracefully, sometimes not, one of the gifts of the Lord is just to be able to sit with these people from whom my heritage comes, from whom my life was sprung, and spend time and love one another again. It's a precious blessing. I hope this summer has opened some things for you in your life. I pray that God has been speaking to you through His Word and Sacrament, and in the course of your living, in your workplace or your play place, or where God has taken you this summer, this morning, as He calls us together as His children, He bids to speak to us again, this gracious and kind and wondrous God. He does it flowing out of this story, this episode, this event from the life of Abraham and Sarah. I want to take you back to it and then into a deeper part of it this morning. It is a teaching that is powerful for us. Abraham and Sarah have a set of visitors that come to them. The scripture said this morning they were men. Some translations say angels. This is actually what we know, loved ones. There was 2 angels that came to visit Abraham and Sarah, and this third that was with the angels was Jesus Himself. I'm going to mark this for you. It's really important. The third that came to Abraham and Sarah to visit, that stopped in for a meal, was Jesus Himself. They spend time. Abraham does what is customary and hospitable. He invites them to a meal. He has Sarah bake. Isn't that good? He creates this situation where one of his servants gets a calf and they get it ready, and he serves these 3 men that are there. And in the course of this meal, Abraham stands and he watches, and he's kind to them and welcoming to them. And then at the end of the meal, before the men are about to leave, this remarkable thing happens. The third of the 3, Jesus Himself. He says to Abraham, and oh, by the way, Sarah's standing right behind him in the door of the tentway listening. He says to Abraham, Abraham, about this time next year I'm going to be back, and your wife Sarah will have had a son. And then we have this. Listen. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? The Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. You know, it's easy for us to see the dilemma, to hear it this morning, to look at it and be well acquainted with it. They're being asked to believe something that can't possibly be true. For those of you who don't know, and for those of you who do, I'll remind you, Sarah's about 90 years old at this point. Abraham's almost 100. And just so you know, things work then just like they do now. And so this idea of God coming to them, this Jesus coming to them and saying to this old woman whose womb is dried up, that she's going to have a baby. Well, just think how impossible that must have been for them to believe. I suspect Sarah laughed because if she didn't laugh, she would have cried. Abraham must have been stunned. And yet there is this reality that they're placed in this dilemma, that this one speaks to them and says, you're going to have a baby, and guess what? You're going to have a baby. And Sarah is thinking to herself, laughing out loud, carrying on, it's way, way, way too late. Which brings me to us, to you and to me. Taking what God says, listen, taking what God says, this word that he speaks to us, and trusting that what he tells us is absolutely so, can be just as challenging for you and me as it was for Abraham and Sarah. It can, loved ones, because sometimes what God says to us, what he says to us, is really hard for us to believe. Sometimes what he promises us seems absolutely impossible. Babies at 90. Try this one on for size. People like you and me being made absolutely perfect. How about this one? We have a life through him that is going to go on forever. Or here's one for you. Every single thing in our lives, this God takes up in his hands and shapes and molds it for our good. For our good. Every single thing. Sometimes what God says to us sounds absolutely impossible. You're going to have a baby. And so you know what we do, all of us? We tend to take what God says and we try to make it fit into what makes sense for us. We'll take this word that we hear on Sunday morning from some preacher and we'll take it up in our hands and we'll kind of mold it and shape it and knock the edges off and see if it'll fit in a box that will work for us, that is reasonable for us. Oh yeah, we'll take what God says and over here, if it makes sense to us, if it is reasonable, if I can fit it in, then it must be true. And if I can't, I'll dump it to the side because it can't be. Sometimes in the course of our Sunday mornings, we'll hear something and it goes in here and comes out here, and in between, what's going on is we're thinking, I don't think so. And so, if it doesn't work, if it doesn't make sense, our most natural reaction, you hear me this morning, our most natural reaction is doubt. It's the Sarah in all of us. I'm 90. And I'm going to have a baby. I'm 100. And I'm going to be a dad. Well, maybe we'd have laughed too. Or cried. And yet, I want you to hear this morning, this is so important for us. God is always true to his word. He is always faithful in what he says. It's always been the case, loved ones. So Jesus and the two angels left, moved on, went away. And days became weeks, which turned into months. And you know what happened? One day Sarah looked down. You got to know this is what happened. One day Sarah looked down and went, oh my gosh. And called Abraham and said, Abraham. And Abraham said something like, oh my gosh. And the baby grew. Because, now listen to this, because God said it would be so. And if he says it's so, it means nothing that it's not reasonable to us or sensible to us or sensical to us. That means nothing. If God says it's so, it will always be so. And a baby boy was born. His name was Isaac. He would be in the line that would come to the place where the Messiah was born. His name was Isaac. I want you to know this morning, loved ones, in your life and mine, as beloved children, as called and claimed and blood-bought children of the kingdom, the same is still true. If God says it is so, it is so. If God proclaims it into your life and mine, no matter how unreasonable or ridiculous or fanciful it might sound to our human reason, if God says it's so, it's so. Today, this morning already, no matter what the sin was in your life and in mine that we brought into this place, what they were, how high the pile was, how big they were, how egregious, no matter what they were, as the word was spoken from a God who has loved you and me with his life, I forgive you. You hear me this morning, because he said it is so, it is absolutely so. Every sin of your life and mine, every single one of them, forgiven and gone. as Jesus speaks this morning, this word that his life is our life. And that because he dwells in us and with us, we're going to live forever. Because he says it's so. Listen to me, loved ones. It is so. And every single turn, every single moment in your life and mine, he is taking what is happening to us and around us and through us and shaping it for our good. Because he says it is so, listen, it is so. In fact, loved ones, that is going to be true all the way to eternity. Today, living our lives on the foundation of because God says so is exactly what we're called to do as his people. This is how it works. First, we listen. We really and truly listen to what he says. In the midst of all the noise, the cacophony, the banging, the clanging of our lives, God calls us to this moment, to this place. And in the sweet silence that he creates, in this tender silence that God gives, he speaks. And listen to this. And it is for you and me as his children by the power of the Holy Spirit to listen, really listen to what he says. Second, we ask God to take away our doubts and grow our faith. We ask him to place us in a place where the word that he speaks to us, no matter how contrary it is to the world, you're going to have a baby. No matter how contrary that you and I, that the doubts that we have, that God just reaches in and takes away from us and he grows our faith. If God says it's so, it's so. And then, loved ones, listen. We live like we believe what he says. I'm going to do this again. Listen. We live like we believe what he says. The sin of my life has been forgiven here this morning by a good and gracious and kind God. Yours too. When we walk out the door this morning after this service is over, we walk out as people who are covered by the blood and absolutely made pure and perfect by a good and gracious and loving God. When we step through the door this morning, the life that Jesus has planted inside of us, he is growing inside of us a life from the empty tomb that nothing can take away. That life is yours and it's mine. And every single step along the way, he is shaping for our good because he loves us so very much. She had a baby. Sometimes what God says is so far beyond us, but it is in our lives in fundamental and important ways. It is the absolute foundation of our living. Sometimes it is hard for us, just like it was for Abraham and Sarah. But loved ones, God is always true to his word. So on this certainty, on this absolute certainty, we rest our faith today and tomorrow and beyond. Because he says so. This morning, this is the teaching of the Lord. If you would rise, please.